Sarah, I've been obsessed throughout my life with the big questions. I was trained in science, I've studied philosophy. Why should I study theology?
Well, theology is learning how to speak rightly about God, and I can't myself think of a bigger question than that. So if you're concerned with answering fundamental ontological questions about the nature of reality, the demands on us of the moral life and spiritual advance, then at some point it seems to me you've got to at least consider that there might be a God. Because if there were, what could be more enticing, exciting, transforming than that? I myself can't remember a time when I didn't feel this extraordinary tug towards the transcendent. I don't know whether some of us are just born that way or whether it's genetically implanted. I've often wanted not to believe in God for lots of actually rather rational reasons, but I found it very difficult to disbelieve in God myself. So theologians are engaged in talking about what it is to speak of God rightly. And that doesn't just involve, although it's a very important part of it, to come up with rational arguments for God's existence. But I think that that's a second-order undertaking. The first-order undertaking is always about praise. It's always about responding in prayer and wonder and awe at a sense of God's call on us. Unfortunately, in academic life, much of what's called theology is what I sometimes naughtily call theologology. It's talking about what other people have said about God. And in fact, that's how you have to train people to begin with. Like any subject, you find out about how to do it by learning what other people have said about it first and cutting your teeth on criticizing them from various directions. But there comes a moment when you actually have to say what you think about this, what you think is the truth. And that's where theology really cuts home.
Now, some would say that the experiential part of religion is what's important. People have told me that I could never progress on this intellectual journey by keeping it intellectual, that you have to internalize it, which perhaps I feel less than others. I have great intellectual interest to learn and to understand, but not necessarily experiential. So as you deal with theology, how do you have that balance between the experiential, the religious experience, and the intellectual side?
I myself think that there shouldn't be a disjunction between those two. There's a very long-standing and especially modern intellectual presumption that the affective or the experiential is somehow different from, disjunctive from, perhaps even inferior to the intellectual. But when you come to think about it, any intellectual endeavor is also experiential. Anyone who's sat in a lab with a scientist will know that there's no such thing as completely
bias-free.
Exactly. Well, bias-free or unexperientially orchestrated quest for truth. I think what's distinctive about my own approach to theology in the contemporary world is that I am insistent in returning to an ancient presumption that theology must involve the practice of prayer, and that this is not an anti-intellectual undertaking, but it's actually an undertaking which over time expands the range of the intellect, integrates the intellect with its affective dimensions, and therefore makes it more capable of responding to God than if it weren't engaged in those practices.
So you have found your intellectual understanding of theology enriched or enhanced by your practice of prayer?
Absolutely. And if you go back to someone early in the Christian tradition, like Evagrius of Pontus, who was one of the early monks, one of the great orchestrators of monastic wisdom, he's famous for saying, the theologian is the one who truly prays. And the one who truly prays is the theologian. That's his definition. So I see myself as trying to re-enliven that tradition in a way that isn't in any sense anti-intellectual. In fact, the fact that it requires practice on one's knees as well as practice in academia makes it more demanding, not less.
You describe yourself, first and foremost, as a systematic theologian. What does that mean?
Well, that's a modern term, and in my definition, what it means is that all the parts of what I say as a theologian should fit together. There should be a coherence in them. Systematic theology has been unpopular in the postmodern period for a number of reasons, which I try to see off in my own writing. One reason is that it suggests some kind of hegemonic attempt to control or grasp the whole of truth. Another objection would be that it inappropriately suggests that we can sew up God, that we can, actually, get God within our grasp. Yet another objection would be a feminist one, that anything that smacks too much of systematicity is usually leaving somebody or someone out. And I think all these objections are profound ones, and they need answering. But nonetheless, if we can't present a coherent vision of our understanding of God, the world, and the self, and show how starting from this position leads inexorably to this and that, then I think we can't say that we are behaving in a scientific fashion.
So as you sum it up and look at the concept of theology, how would you try to characterize it?
Theology is the quest for God, which draws forth for one the deepest desire to express appropriately one's response to the transcendent call of God. That's what I would say in a nutshell. But since that takes up into it inexorably all aspects of reality that are drawn into that tether, it's one of those topics which is never ending. It's like the horizon at the edge of the sea, which when you get there, you see there's more.